leading up to the ignition sequence at 8.9 seconds.
Total attitude, verify roll 162.
Verified.
Pitch 090.
Verified.
Yaw 0.
Verified.
BMAG mode, roll, pitch, and yaw to rate command. Standby, rate 1.
Roger, BMAG mode's going, rate 1.
Alright, FDAI scale to 5.5.
5.5.
Alright, CDR panel 1, rate switch high.
Rate switch high.
Alright, CDR and CMP, arm your road controllers and verify.
CDR verified. CMP verified.
CDR panel 1, road controller power, direct 1 and 2, main A, main B.
Roger. Complete.
CMC mode, free.
CMC mode free.
Transcontroller power switch, on up.
That's up.
546, verifying. Alright, Stoney, put the Astro launch on VHF.
Oh, Sony, CDR loud and clear. All 11 loud and clear. CDR reach STC loud and clear. Sony, Paul 11 reach loud and clear. LM, Paul 11 reach loud and clear. Reach loud and clear.
You will. Call again. This is GNC. I got a hard copy for you.
Roger, this is Savannah Reed.
Stoney, you have it there? Okay, Stoney.
All launch stations stand by on net 1 for final status check.
Okay, flight, perform your comm check and verify completion.
Contact, pilot, Hector.
TV. Let me get
Pilot.
Sony, Paul 11 reach loud and clear.
Flight network. Go ahead. Pilot, configure for the simplex check.
Roger, Bruce, reach loud and clear. Paul 11 reach loud and clear.
Apollo 11 LMP, this is Houston on S-band. How do you read? Over.
Houston, you're loud and clear, Howie.
Roger, read you the same. Out.
Understand.
Burn S-point ramp when the last commercial went. When did the last commercial fly?
Flight recovery.
This is Apollo Saturn launch control. We passed the 11-minute mark. Now T-minus 10 minutes, 54 seconds on our countdown for Apollo 11. All still go at this time. The astronauts in the spacecraft busy again. The commander, Neil Armstrong, has performed some final switch settings for the stabilization and control system of the spacecraft. The spacecraft also now is on full internal power. This came shortly after the 15-minute mark. The spacecraft now on the full power of its fuel cells. Up to this time, it had been sharing the load with an external power source. Both Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin have armed their rotational hand controllers, the controllers they use in flight. And we have now gone to automatic system with the emergency detection system. That system that would cue the astronauts if there's trouble down below with the Saturn V rocket during the powered flight. We're now coming up to our 10-minute mark, 10 minutes away from our planned liftoff. Mark, T-minus 10 minutes and counting, T-minus 10. We're aiming for our planned liftoff at 32 minutes past the hour. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
Canary network, net 1.
Roger, it's an Alpha.
Canary network, net 1.
John, can you hear me now? We're going to get a commercial.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We passed the 6-minute mark in our countdown for Apollo 11. Now 5 minutes, 52 seconds and counting. We're on time at the present time for our planned liftoff of 32 minutes past the hour. Spacecraft test conductor Skip Chauvin now has completed the status check of his personnel in the control room. All report they are go for the mission, and this has been reported to the test supervisor, Bill Schick. The test supervisor now going through some status checks. Launch operations manager Paul Donner reports go for launch. Launch director Rocco Petrone now gives a go for 5 minutes, 20 seconds and counting. Coming up shortly, that swing arm up at the spacecraft level will come back to its fully retracted position. This should occur at the 5-minute mark in the count.
9, 8,
In the meantime,
7,
the Lunar Mars
6,
telemetry
5,
has been powered down.
4,
It's a good look
3,
and
2,
good.
1,
The spacecraft
mark.
test conductor for the Lunar
Hello. Welcome, and welcome to the StarNet Library Alliance and the American Museum of Natural History here with our open space run-through today of how we actually landed on the moon with Apollo 11 50 years ago. in just about a week on July 20th. In fact, being July 15th today, tomorrow being the 16th, will be the 50th anniversary of the launch. I am Carter Emmard. I'm the Director of Astrovisualization here at the American Museum of Natural History, and here along with Micah Achinapura.
Hi.
One of our developers for open space, and this is a collaboration. Open space is a freely available open source software which you can download thanks to NASA's Science Mission Directorate and what's called the Science Activation Group funding that we received in 2015, that we bring this development visualizing not only Apollo, not only space missions from NASA, but also from around the world, different missions from different countries, but also the exploration of the universe beyond that, and what we call our digital universe, which is a compendium, an atlas of the universe brought together here at the American Museum of Natural History for us, for you to explore. So you can download OpenSpace as a software from openspaceproject.com. And this collaboration started between our museum and Linköping University in Sweden, and where Dr. Alex Bach, our lead code developer, is actually with us right now, I believe, to actually look at some of your comments and questions and field them onto us. And we're proud to be able to bring this to you today. So starting off, I'd like to begin by showing how we left the Earth. What we're going to visualize here, because we really want to visualize the landing of Apollo 11, we are going to start off with how we left the Earth with a trajectory leaving from the launch site at Cape Canaveral and reaching the moon. So we're going to visualize that first. We're just going to visualize not the Saturn V launch and so forth, which you can see by many different video sources historically, but we're going to come down close to the launch. Micah, could we actually bring us back to the launch from Florida, if that's possible? Okay, just going to go back, and so we're actually going to visualize this thanks to some work that was done in reconstructing the orbit, in this case by the Science Visualization Studio at NASA Goddard. Ernie Wright, who is one of the visualizers there, has done a reconstruction based on the historical records. In this case, we're going to show Apollo 8, and we're showing the launch. Let's come a little closer if we could. I'd like to tip over so that we can actually see. This is Florida, which we see in view, and the little peninsula of Cape Canaveral reaching out. We'll get a little closer in here. Right now, the trajectory is a little hard to see. We're going to see it a little darker here. Leaving Cape Canaveral, and then reaching up. First, Apollo was flying upwards vertically to get through most of the atmosphere, but as the atmosphere thins out, we begin to fly sort of parallel to it and thrusting until we achieve orbit. And so the Apollo missions did this by using the Saturn V giant rocket, 363 feet tall. The first stage fired for about 2.5 minutes and dropped away. Then it fired its second stage rocket that was to burn out and finally be augmented by the third stage, which would achieve orbit along with the command module that had the 3 astronauts inside, as well as the lunar module behind them in an intertank with 4 doors that would be exposed. So here we can see the thickness of the atmosphere. It's about 20 miles or 30 kilometers thick, depicted here for this perspective that we're seeing the Cape Canaveral and the launch. The launch pointing actually shows just the peninsula of Cape Canaveral. They're actually a little bit north of that, to be quite honest. So a little bit of work in this reconstruction. But nevertheless, I think we'll back out now so that we can see the more general picture, so that we can look back here across the state of Florida. You see the path reach up as they launched on December. I'm sorry. In this case, this is Apollo 8, which did launch in December of 1968, which we have the reconstruction for. But we will switch over to Apollo 11 as we get out to the moon. We're pulling back so that we're now seeing this with an image of Earth. This is an image of Earth that's more recent. Okay, and Mike is now going to play the path, and we go around in one orbit and then a second orbit, and then finally it comes around, and there it's the difference between the first and second orbit is that on the second orbit they fired their engine starting on the night side of Earth that built up speed to the escape velocity of Earth, so that we're leaving the Earth. And in the case of Apollo 8 in December of 1968 was the first time a human crew ever left the Earth from low Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit is just really a couple hundred miles off the Earth. You sort of think of the width of the state of Pennsylvania, about 300 miles. So a typical orbit for Apollo, just to check out the hardware and make sure everything was right, was about 100 miles. And so then they burn the third stage to give them the impulse to get to the moon. The moon is quite far away. It's about 1,000 times the distance of low Earth orbit. If we say the low Earth orbit is about 250 miles, well, the moon is 250,000 miles away. So what we're going to do is we're going to back out here so we can show you the trans-lunar or the drift, is so that we're leaving the Earth. We're just guiding by a different frame of reference here, that we're now going to progress from the Earth to the moon. So we'll back off here. We see the moon over on the right side, our destination, and it has a line which is the orbit of the moon around Earth.
And I've now hit our webcam so that we can get full image.
Great.
Okay. Now we will watch as this heads towards the moon.
And where they aim is where the moon will be. And so the moon and Apollo are aimed basically at a point in the ahead of where the moon is. You don't aim at where the moon is right now. You aim where you will arrive, hopefully at the same time that the moon is there. And so this is all guided by classical mechanics. As I said, Sir Isaac Newton was in the driver's seat. Here we are getting close to the moon. Can we pull in a little bit, Mike? Oh, that's great. From this vantage point, we see the starry backdrop. They use the stars to guide in navigation, just as the ancient sailing mariners did, to get a fix on their orientation in space.
He's asking if we can explain how this data was made.
So, question came in on how this data is made. What we have is a historical record of launch times, and then we also have a ground track to create the orbit properly. But then using basically the laws of physics in projecting the trajectory on out between the Earth and the moon to arrive at the moon at just the right time, where the gravity of the moon takes over and they begin to spiral around the moon. These are the orbits around the moon. Here you see it looks like a sort of corkscrew, but that's with respect to the moon moving along its path. And so as we do, it traces out, as the moon proceeds along its orbit, so too it sort of leads this spiral. But if we change our viewpoint to the Earth itself, what we're going to do is now just pull back, and we're going to do a segue here specifically to Apollo 11, where Ernie Wright has reconstructed these paths because we've known the orbital altitudes, we know the ground track, and that that this had been put together more recently. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in to look at the moon. Now, we started off showing the Apollo 8 trajectory. That was a December mission, but when we came to landing on the moon the next summer, so July of 1969, that it was a summer mission. So the trajectory, and the arrival time is different. So we're coming up now specifically on the recreation of Apollo 11. And we're just going to change pilots. I'm going to take over the piloting here to sort of come in on the moon, seeing the orbits of Apollo 11.
We had a question from the chat that said, how did they know space was safe to go to?
Well, that's how do we know space was safe? Well, we didn't know that. And so the whole idea of the progression toward the moon was an incremental approach of basically first launching just above the atmosphere. The first human in space is Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union, who was able to orbit the Earth in their first flight. Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom in the Mercury program did suborbital flights, and they landed in the Atlantic Ocean after being blasted off from Cape Canaveral. But the Gemini program was the program that allowed us to test operations in orbit, namely to rendezvous with something else that we had sent up, because we were going to rely on that for Apollo, where it was decided to use lunar orbit rendezvous. In other words, we come to the moon in 2 spacecraft and then separate the lunar module, the lander, from the command ship for the maneuver to come down to the surface. What we see here is first a high orbit of Apollo 11, and this is the orbit that they use to sort of get into this overall lunar orbit, which was then adjusted to a sort of lower staging orbit. And so we're, yeah, okay, so we're just going to,
Get away from the subtitles.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And we'll do that. Great. Okay, so with this, what we're looking at is a mapping of the moon. This is an image, mosaic, that's been put together from our Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is a polar mission. It orbits from the North Pole to the South Pole, and over time builds up many, many images that are put together into this image mosaic. Looking at it, I'm looking at the South Pole right now. And so the lighting looks a little strange because the lighting is completely ruled by the fact that it's always low inclination lighting. So we never have direct sun, where we have direct sun on the other parts. But I'm showing you this view essentially so that we can see the orbit that they initially go into and then lower that. So the crew of Apollo 11, we have Neil Armstrong, commander, of course, and lunar module pilot, meaning basically the commander's co-pilot, Buzz Aldrin, and also command module pilot who did not, unfortunately, get to go down and walk on the moon, but had the very important job of keeping the command ship in good shape, and that was Michael Collins, who they would come up with, rendezvous with to ride home. So now we see this green line that departs, and that green line is the separation of the lunar module from the command ship to come in for a landing. Now, the moon is tidally locked to Earth, and what that means is that we always see the same face of the moon when we look up at the night sky. And so right here, if I just show us, we see the orbits, but also we can kind of see from this orientation the old man in the moon, the sort of 2 eyes that's made of Mare Imbrium and the Sea of Serenity, and then below that the Sea of Tranquility, which our green line is approaching for landing. So what I'm going to do is switch our data set that we're looking at this with. We're on the wide angle camera mosaic right now. Micah, could we go to, we're going to go to another map of the moon, which is higher resolution. It's from our colleagues in Japan, a mission called Kaguya. And whereas the map we were just looking at is a very good global map. This map that we're switching to will give us sort of higher precision, higher resolution when we're coming in to fly over the lunar surface on this final descent. The few black squares you see in here are just some missing data. centered?
Here.
Okay.
Just have to have the mouse.
Oh, okay. Very good. All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to bring us down now to a moment in time with the lunar module approaching. It has basically gotten into, they did once they separated from the command ship, they did a burn to bring it to an orbit that comes down very low to about 50,000 feet, or about 15 kilometers from the surface. And but then that low point is a fail-safe point to where they could launch and abort. This is basically what Apollo 10 did, was they came down and skimmed over the moon at this low altitude, but then came back up to just join back up with the command ship. But in this case, coming in low, what I'd like to do is just show you, if I get down low enough, we can see the altitude. It's skimming over the surface, and its altitude is, it's about, it should be about, it's about 50,000 feet. It's actually, they began power descent from a point over Mount Maryland, which we'll show you here. Mount Maryland was named by Jim Lovell for his wife, Marilyn. It's finally been accepted as an official name on the moon. I'm just going to back up. We can see the trajectory reaching over, but it's this triangular mountain, which is just off to the right of the trajectory, this little triangular mountain here. And this is where the decision is made to go on power descent for the last about 12 minutes. And they're going to fire the rocket engine, and this is going to lower their orbit for their landing on the surface. So what we're going to do now is just we're going to come in, and we're going to see the orientation of the lunar module. And so I'm going to hand this back over to Micah to come in and fly us, I think. But we're coming up on the LEM right here. Very good. Okay. And the LEM is flying in a sort of almost with a windows up direction. Prior to them firing the engine, they were basically, the windows are looking down. The LEM has this funny sort of look to it. It almost has eyes and a mouth, and the landing legs. We'll just come in and see this. I'm not sure if I could change the lighting to be a little different, but anyway, communication antennas. We see a little porch out the front door, and we can see the sort of two eyes of the LEM looking out these triangular windows. It was designed so we could look down at the lunar surface coming in. And also you can see these little jet thrusters to keep its orientation. And then the big engine at the bottom is down below, which is thrusting. So what I'd like to do is just turn us around, and Michael will proceed, I think, with the time we have. We see the orbits of Mike Collins orbiting above, so that's up there as well. That sort of provides a nice point, shows us our general aim, which we're flying in with the sun at our backs, and generally landing with a very low sun angle, and this determined the exact launch time. Was the type of lighting that was desired at the lunar surface. And they wanted to come in very early morning lighting, so any obstacles would throw shadows, so it would make that easier to see.
So I'll play the video now. You want
to
talk about it, and then
we'll
just play, and you can.
So what we'd like to show is a video of some VR work that was put together in the interior of the lunar module. So we'll see that up in a second. Great. And this shows you what the inside of the lunar module looks like, and so that we can see the instrument panel, which is between the windows, and then that also something for them to hold on to there. They're in a standing position. They did not have seats. Originally they thought they'd have seats, but that was like too much weight, and they were fighting weight on the lunar module. The lunar module size and weight determined how big the rocket would have to be in launching all of this from the surface of Earth in one rocket. And so the lunar module had to be quite light, and but here we can see the instrument panel between, and also their backpacks, and looking into
Someone asked,
the entry.
how many times did Collins orbit while Aldrin and Armstrong were preparing to land?
Well, that's actually a good question. I'm not exactly certain how many times, but they would go basically an orbit that Mike Collins was in was about a 2-hour orbit for one orbit around the moon. And when they separated and came down, the final descent to lunar surface taking place in about an hour, just a little bit over, between firing their engine on the backside of the moon to bring them into this orbit that came down to 50,000 feet or 15 kilometers off the surface, and then begin their thrusting in this position. The astronauts don't see the moon, but the reason for this is that the radar was on the bottom of the spacecraft, and so the radar is bouncing. I was show that a little bit.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So shall I navigate here? Is that if I just come around this side of the lunar module, by the way, this was done as a photogrammetry scan from the LEM-2, which is at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. So it's this silver device back down here, which is actually the radar, which is picking up how far they are off the lunar surface. And so we'll just fly back out a little bit more, and we're proceeding. There we see the Earth out in front of the LEM. And now
we're paused.
Now we're paused. So
ready to go ahead to the land.
Yeah. So let's proceed.
So now I'm going to transition us to we can do the 3 minutes of landing.
Great. Okay. What we thought we'd like to do is we've worked with different interpretations of the trajectory based on image analysis, as well as historical records from several colleagues, and so that has been combined here into a visualization of the final descent, which we thought we would sync up with the transcript, actually the recording of what was happening during the actual landing.
Trail or no trail?
We'll leave the trail on.
Okay. We're ready to go?
Great.
It looks okay. Not a bad looking area. Eagle looking great. You go.
Hoping the audio is loud enough for you all.
I'll make it a little louder.
1,400 feet, still looking very good. 30 is good.
At this point, so I hope my talking and you listening is too bad, but at this point, the computer is actually
700 feet, 21 down, 33 degrees, pretty rocky area. 600 feet, down 19.
So at this point, right here, the computer was guiding Apollo 11 to land next to this crater. This is West Crater, and Armstrong sees boulders that are about the size of the lunar module, about the size of cars, and not a good place to land. So he actually brings the lunar module forward a little bit to pick up speed, and is looking for a nice clear landing spot. And so as he does this, he's getting very low on fuel. And he's choosing a new landing spot, which just happens to be the computer. He's flying along with the computer, but he's flying it like a helicopter. It actually controlled better than he thought, than the device that he tested with back on Earth. But he's gliding toward West Crater. At this point and at this altitude, they began to pick up dust from the exhaust of the engine, beginning to obscure their view, but also Armstrong deciding, well, we need to sort of push on beyond this crater. We can't land in this crater. So we begin to fly on beyond Little West Crater, and just beyond this, coming down within about 100 feet, and hovering, but he's still looking for a nice, safe place to land.
3.5 down, 9 forward. 5%. On any bite?
a lot of dust. They get a warning at 60 seconds of fuel.
60 seconds. 60 seconds.
And he's hovering just to make sure of a safe point. You give us a sense of the altitude. I'll turn around and we see the trail, but now coming in for a landing. 30 seconds of fuel. You get the warning.
30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow.
We hear Buzz Aldrin reporting on their velocities and their altitude.
30 seconds. Forward, just a moment.
And drifting to their left, after they were drifting to the right, they come down, contact, and land.
Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Auto descent. Auto control both auto descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. Port 13 is in.
So we had a question of if the fact that he altered the landing spot affected their takeoff.
Well, that's a very good question. They had enough latitude insofar as landing, and they landed long, that in taking off, their rendezvous would be coordinated, and they would update as best that they could from their assumed position for basically the final rendezvous with Mike Collins and coming back. So obviously it didn't affect it too much in the negative, and they were able to obviously come home. But part of the reason that they landed long was that we didn't really understand the moon's gravity, how that varies. And it varies because when we look up and we see the dark regions of the moon, these are lava flows that have come in and seeped into large impact basins. And where that occurs, and more mass is a sort of deeper upwellings of lava in these areas, it creates basically an imbalance to the moon's gravity field. And so these mass concentrations, as they were called, caused them to go long. And so unfortunately, that made them, they still landed within their landing ellipse, their sort of projected area of landing. But there were some computer screw-ups as well. They went through several alarms. And what was happening there was that their rendezvous radar for in the case of an abort to come back up and meet with Mike Collins was on at the same time as their altitude radar. And that caused the computer to sort of be overwhelmed. And so the computer had two alarms where it essentially was it was overflowing with numbers beyond its control. So thanks to Mission Control, they recognized this and said, you're go on those alarms, and they went all the way down and landed. So here we are on the surface. Once again, this is our scan of the lunar module that's at the National Air and Space Museum. But we see Armstrong and his walk onto the moon, stepping out in the scale. They had to come down a ladder off the front porch. And also, he would pull a ring, a D-ring, that would unhinge this little folding contraption that had tools and also the TV camera to point at his famous first step on the moon, and so that we see that. Notice how the ground plane is very low resolution at this point, but we're putting the lunar module in proper scale to images that are taken more recently from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. And that shows the shadow of the descent portion of the LEM. So we have a couple pictures of the lunar module we'd like to show you. We're going to show you just some slides of that. This is an original conception of the LEM, and because it had to be very lightweight and it had to hold pressure, it was thought that maybe it'd be best to have it almost, this looks almost like an aluminum balloon, but it was very rounded shaped. But again, the spindly legs would come in and kind of land like a helicopter. And so we're going to go to the next picture. This is a later conception. We can see a ladder coming down, not down the front leg, but sort of a vertical ladder. And also the sort of mouth of the lunar module, you see the triangular eyes. It's sort of a round shape, and that's when they considered that they might dock with the command ship from the front of it like this. But they also have a hatch on the top that is how we actually did the docking. And so that door on the way out became squarish. So we can go to the next picture.
Yeah.
And so here we can actually see the construction of one of the first study lunar modules, and you can see it has this kind of, still has a round door out the front. But this is very, very lightweight aluminum. This is at Grumman on Long Island. This is where it was put together in New York State on Long Island. And very lightweight aluminum, and like the wings of an airplane, there are struts to sort of hold the structural shape. It was so lightweight aluminum that you could have jammed a pen right through it and to punch a hole in it. So it's essentially a aluminum balloon with fuel tanks. If we go to the next picture, here we see some of the fuel tanks. This is before the skins are put on. And even those struts, which look large, are actually just rolled pieces of aluminum. So again, think very, very lightweight. So we see the various fuel tanks, and now we see the installation of the thruster engines. Next picture. Thanks, Micah. Here we actually see LEM 2. As I understand this, maybe LEM 2 was just a little heavy, so it did not become a lunar module in service, and it ended up as a display piece on the mall in Washington, D.C. as LEM 2, and before they were about to do the renovations on this, the struts that you see, they took off the panels, and you can see once again the fuel tanks as we saw in the previous picture. Very, very lightweight, and the skins that were put on. So the next picture, I guess, is that here we see. Just that thin aluminum skin is enough to, if a micrometeoroid is coming in, it gets hit by that first very thin panel, but it diffuses and probably vaporizes even the smaller micrometeoroids. So micrometeoroid protection, even in spacesuits, is all about having layers. Here we see, this is Apollo 15, and that is the first lunar rover with its wheels tucked in, about to be folded up into that one of 4 bays. There's a sort of cruciform of the descent stage, which were all engine tanks, or 4 engine tanks supplying the fuel for the central engine that would enable them to brake and come in and land, as we just saw. So the next picture, this is a nice picture showing all the workers there in Grumman who built the lunar modules, and so we see this picture from back in the 1960s when they were producing these. And next shot is, we'd like to include this shot because this shows what's left there now. The ascent stage took off, bringing the astronauts back safely, and the 6 times we landed on the moon. And but in each case, the descent stage is left behind for its weight and so forth, but also provided a launch platform for them to take off from. This picture was taken from a color camera on board one of the rovers. I'm not actually sure which mission this is. Grab this picture. But in those 3 last missions, the scientific missions, so-called J missions, that they all had this color TV camera on board the rover, and so they could get a picture like this. Next picture is an early concept of the Lunar Excursion Module, as it was called then, with President John Kennedy and other NASA officials around. There's also Vice President Johnson there. And but this is what the concept of the lunar module looked like while Kennedy was still alive in this visit to NASA, I believe, in 1962. This was a year after he made the commitment for the U.S. to land on the moon. We can see it's rounded for its pressure vessel shape, but they hadn't really thought out everything yet. So, okay, I think we're done with the slides. And
somebody asked if we were going to show any actual footage of the land, and another person asked, how did Armstrong know that they had actually touched the surface?
Well, those are 2 really good questions.
Do we maybe want to show the last minute in a little window?
We could. We can certainly do that. We understood basically when we're in contact with the lunar surface by there's 4 footpads. The one in the back and the 2 on the sides, the 2 landing pads, had basically a spring-activated probe that just sort of stuck down. The lunar module would come down, they would fold to the side. And but when they were activated, when they were actually touching the lunar surface, and they would activate just because they were being sort of feeling the surface, that essentially would terminate the rocket engine. So it would turn the rocket engine off, and it would just fall the last few feet.
So the engine would cut out automatically once the surface contacts were triggered.
Right. That's right. And so in this case, Apollo 11 was slipping to the left, and when they landed, you could see the probes were stuck out in that direction. And so then they went out for EVA. Armstrong was out for about 45 minutes before Buzz joined him on the lunar surface. They set up the flag. The TV camera, they took off the Mesa, which is the name of that little folding structure that came down. So they took that and they planted it about 100 feet away. And then they also set up a seismometer and a laser reflector that we could do laser range finding from the location. And so with the video you're talking about,
I could just show this, just a minute.
Let's do that.
Okay.
So Mike is going to do that now, and then I'd like to show.
So you see, it'll be like this.
Great. So in this case, what we're seeing is footage that was not on TV. This is a 16 millimeter camera out of Buzz Aldrin's window, looking down, and that's the big crater that the computer was targeting them on. And so I don't want to rotate too much here. So as we come in here over this crater, they're going to fly beyond. And so we'll come in for final landing.
The footage on the left is the actual video.
Yeah, the footage on the left was a 16 millimeter camera footage. And in fact, I mentioned that big crater they tried to avoid. That would have been earlier in the descent sequence.
Here we can see the dust.
Good, down a half.
Yes, and now we can see in image on the left, the dust has been picked up by the descent engine in about the last 100 feet or so.
Down 2.5.
And then the shadow of the lunar module extending out in front of it. Once again, they landed at dawn, basically, so that early illumination of lighting on the airless moon, any obstacle would be clearly seen.
Shadow. 4 forward.
There we can see the landing leg and the probe, actually, a little thin line. And within the dust, hard to see down, and then finally it touches the moon. And then they sort of fall the last little bit. Boom. Engine stop, and then you hear them going their description of basically shutting off all the equipment to basically safe themselves for the stay on the moon. So they landed at about 4:16 in the afternoon. That's Eastern Daylight Time, and it was about 6 hours later that they got out and walked, did their EVA. First walk on the moon.
And now we're going to pull away. Right.
So, can we show the lighting?
The flip book.
Yeah. So these images that we see here now are from our Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. If we park here just for a second, we can see a line sort of going from the lunar module off to that crater in the back. That crater is, about 100 feet or about 30 meters in size. And we see a line which is actually the footprints of Neil Armstrong. He walked over there and he took a picture of his shadow looking back. But a lot of the pictures, the famous picture of the astronaut on the moon, are Buzz, because Neil had the camera and was taking pictures of Buzz. They both had their Hasselblad cameras. But what we're going to do now is actually look at different Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter pictures. Now, this is the narrow angle camera of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. And here we see different lighting conditions. This is sunset lighting conditions. And once again, it's that descent stage, the lower portion of the lunar module, which is still there today, casting shadows. And the resolution that we see is give or take about a half a meter to a quarter meter in resolution. And so we don't see things in very high detail here, but it is pretty high detail considering that it's in orbit. Here we can actually see the lunar module reflecting light, and just above it we can see the science experiments of the seismometer and the laser reflector that they put out there. So we can go through another couple pictures, but this shows that we've not only just taken one picture from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, but multiple pictures of different lighting conditions to actually show what we've left on the moon. And we have similar pictures to all the Apollo landing sites.
So we had a question if any of the astronauts had expressed any concern about the unknown nature of stepping outside, and basically their feelings around stepping out into an unknown world. Well,
it's every landing site would be unique in that sense, but we had sent several robotic probes, the lunar surveyors, to the moon. Not all of them were successful. Some crash landed, but the ones that landed, we knew that the moon had a sort of powdery surface, but that nevertheless still a hard enough surface. But we tested that with the probes first, just to make sure that the lunar module wasn't going to settle into some dusty area that might overwhelm the lunar module. There were different ideas that maybe there was this dust covering, that the dust was suspended by electrostatic conditions from the solar wind, maybe creating dust that the lunar module might sink into and never be heard from again. Another was that maybe there's ice just below the powdery surface, and that the lunar module, when it's set down, might skid. So there are those that feel that some of these concerns, although they couldn't be ruled out, led to sort of an over-design of the legs of the lunar module. So in this case, we could see the multiple pictures, but we'd like to actually take you now to our last mission to the moon. Of course, we landed 6 times. With Apollo 11, we really just got out and walked around for about an hour and a half and collected rocks, set up some experiments. But it was really the mission where we landed on the moon for the first time, and that we were able to learn from that in landing and then go back, and for a total of 6 missions. So we're pulling back. The moon is sort of upside down in a north-south direction, but Mike is pulling back as we're going to reset time. We started off showing the trajectory of Apollo 8, which was a December mission. Apollo 11 landed in July, but we just jumped ahead in time to a December mission. We're on the other side of the solar system, essentially, as the Earth goes around the sun in our seasonality, and that's why the moon, suddenly we see the far side of the moon. But we're just maneuvering around here, so in open space we've reset the clock essentially for December 1972, and the exploration of perhaps the grandest of the Apollo missions, saved the best for last, the mission to the Valley of Taurus-Littrow, between the Sea of Serenity, which is sort of just below us now, and above the Sea of Tranquility. So that we're coming into, and you can see a little postage stamp in the middle here, and it's the Valley of Taurus-Littrow. Mike is going to take us slowly around, and then we'll try to shoot the approach that the astronauts came in on. So you need to rotate another 180. These are 90. Good. Now, where Micah has us, north is essentially up, east is to our right, and west is to the left. And they were flying in from the east because of the orbit that they went into. Very similar, slightly different inclination, but the orbit that we saw coming in. Do we have is this the Kaguya?
No.
Oh, let's make sure. What I want to do is just, okay, we're turning on the Kaguya. Can we give Kaguya a little boost in gamma? We can adjust this. Or we can raise its multiplier up a little bit. What we're doing is I'm asking Micah to kind of adjust the map here so that they kind of brings the surroundings of this high resolution inset that we're coming into. The blending is a little nicer. That's great. So they came in at a low inclination, just like Apollo 11, skimming over these mountains, but we figured out really how to navigate better and better with each successive mission. And so Apollo 17 was one of the last 3 missions, brought in the Lunar rover, so that we could not just get out and walk around, but drive around. So we're coming in to the valley. Over to the left is South Massif. It's 2,300 meters, taller than a mile, deeper than the Grand Canyon, as Jack Schmitt, the only geologist to go to the moon. Here, the scientist, astronaut, got to fly on the last mission. Commander Gene Cernan is flying the lunar module. Challenger was its name, down to the surface. I didn't even mention that Apollo 11's lunar module was Eagle. I should have, but here we are. We're passing Crater Sherlock and on our way toward Camelot, which is out beyond the landing site. We see this sort of light gray mapping area, and we can see that in the middle, the light gray, that's the dust that was kicked up by Challenger coming in for a landing. And as we come closer, we can begin to resolve their labels for scientific experiments that were left, but there's also LRV, which we can see just a little bit off to the left there. That's the lunar roving vehicle. So that's rover 3. It's the 3rd rover we brought to the moon, and they parked it basically to the east of the lunar module, so from a safe distance that an operator of the video, Ed Fendel was his name, in mission control, could film the ascent of the lunar module. Let's come in closer, Micah. And from here, we can actually see parallel tracks of the rover. We can see a marking of the flag. And you can see then the darker footprints of the astronauts walking back and forth to their science experiment package that they put out in front. Now, from here, if we just stop here for a moment, Micah, we can see above and to the right of the lunar module says the flag, and if you look down on the ground, what we see is some darkness there. That's the shadow of the flag in this Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter picture. Beyond that, you can also see a track, or their rover, I'm sorry, not rover, but they're just their boot prints out beyond the flag. And there are pictures, I'm not sure which of the astronauts, whether it was Gene Cernan or Jack Schmitt, had gone out there, but they were composing a picture of the flag with the lunar module behind it. And so you can go to Project Apollo archives on Flickr and see every picture that was taken by the Apollo astronauts, both orbiting the moon and on the moon from their Hasselblad cameras.
We had a question from Barbara about the receiving imagery from the moon and how long it took them. Am I right that Apollo 17, they actually had TV footage and they could receive it right away?
Well, we had TV footage with Apollo 11, that little folding mesa that would fold down would have the camera. We'd see that on this model too, on Challenger. It's the same model, we're just substituting here. But then the camera on Apollo 11 was carried out, had a cable, a tripod. They set it up so that we could all watch on the moon. But thank you. But with the lunar rover, they had a color camera, and so we were able to, even though the moon is gray, we could see the commander wore red stripes on his spacesuit, so we could always tell which one was the commander. And you could see the gold foil and so forth, whatever was colorful, and also the blue of the Earth when they could aim the camera up at the Earth. So let's pull back here. We can see the ALSEP. That's the Apollo Lunar Science Experiment Package. Each mission had that. In the case of Apollo 11, we just put out a seismometer and basically a laser reflector. And but here on the more extended missions, they would stay on the moon with Apollo 17 3 days, and so they had 3 extravehicular activities, which means 3 moonwalks. They went out, set up those science packages, which were seismometers. They blew off explosives to actually bounce the. They had an array of seismometers, so they could actually measure from the echo of the explosive charges they let off the depth of the volcanic layers. And we can see Camelot Crater, which is, I think, about 800 meters, just shy of a kilometer in scale. That was named by Jack Schmitt in honor of John Kennedy's administration. This had been called Camelot. Of course, Jack Kennedy sending us on our way to the moon as part of the space race. The crater Horatio, and beyond that, we can see this day 2 of the second EVA. We're going to drive out to its destination at the base of the South Massif, which is to the lower left. That mountain, South Massif, we can see these gray patches that reach across the valley of Taurus Littrow. The valley is about 7 miles wide, about 10 kilometers, 6.5 miles or so wide. We also see that they're going to drive to the base of that, but they had to drive over this Lee Scarp. It's called the Lee-Lincoln Scarp, which some believe the formation of the scarp is a thrust fault, may be responsible for the landslides, and so that light material coming off the base of the South Massif, and they wanted to see material that had come down, that cascading down the mountain in that landslide. And so Gene Cernan drove the rover up and over the hill. In fact, from their position down on the ground, you can't even see their destination. They're just basically driving up, but their destination is at the base of the landslide. And we can actually see how it half buries this crater called Nansen. So if we incline a little bit, we can see up to the top of the screen. There we go. Nansen-Apollo. That's a half-buried crater. At this point, we can actually see the toe of the landslide, thanks to the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter imagery. The U.S. Geological Survey and the German Space Agency, DLR, have collaborated to put together this mosaic of high-resolution images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. And we can come in and we're seeing full resolution in this little patch here. This is a little map study area. It shows LRV, shows you where they parked the rover. And we can also see major boulders that they came up to investigate. We can also see markers for the north, east, and southwest pans. Those are panoramic photography areas where they did sort of a 360 panorama. But thanks to their multiple images that they took with their Hasselblad cameras, we can come down and actually look at these boulders, which we've reconstructed in a similar way that we made the model of the lunar module. Using multiple pictures in a process called photogrammetry, we used the reality capture commercial software to sort of make these models. In fact, one of our high school students from the Bergen County Academies put these together for us to actually look at the boulders. They've been doing some photogrammetry experiments in their high school, and we said, well, why not do this with some of the photography we actually have from the moon? What this little thing is in the foreground that we have some color chips on, the photogrammetry didn't resolve the actual sort of spindly nature of this little tripod thing. It was called the gnomon. And it stood about waist height, and it could swivel to give you a local vertical. And here we see its shadow on the rock. So it gives you a sense of scale. So those color chips have kind of come up to about the height of your knee. So we can get a sense of human scale and the 3D nature of this boulder. We can also, we don't have time to do this now, but actually look at places where they took samples from this rock, which are now at the Lunar Receiving Lab in Houston to this day. And so did you have that?
No, slide.
Okay. So we can also see on the right, there's some boot prints where one of the astronauts, I believe it was Gene Cernan, took the picture of looking back at this boulder. Now we only have one side of the boulder, because they didn't take pictures of the other side. But there's a famous picture of this boulder looking up, and the Earth is right above it. And it always confounded me because I thought the Earth was higher in the sky. I didn't quite know that that this picture, they're looking up this steep slope of the South Massif, and there's the Earth posed in open space exactly where it was there in December 1972 when they did the moonwalk. So from here, this was the longest drive they ever did on the moon. Their third day on the moon, well, there's another boulder, Boulders 1, and a little boulder they called Boulder 3. And we'll turn our attention away from here. I'd like to look the other way if we could, Micah. And we're going to look across the valley so that their last excursion on the moon was to go to a set of boulders that had rolled down the North Massif. The North Massif stood about 2,000 meters, or maybe just a little shy of that, above the valley of Taras-Littrow. And, that's what happens if we fly inside the moon. It's easy to do just if we're pivoting around things, but it's okay. We're going to come down now. We're retargeting essentially to this destination, quite spectacular. On our last time we did a moonwalk, once again, December 1972. The spectacular launch of Apollo 17 was a night launch. It was the only time the Saturn V launched at night. There's Henry Crater. They drove around it. And what Mike has done is brought in a picture from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. Oh, this is great, Michael. Let's just pan around. I want to sort of pause here for a second. What we see are, you can see in the subtlety here, but there are boulder tracks. So there is also this notion, perhaps when the valley shook because of the formation of the Lee Scarp, that it shook some boulders away from their outcrop locations farther up the hill. And so we can see that this boulder, which we now call Station 6, and it's been called Split Rock because as it rolled down the hill, it broke into two. But we can see multiple boulder tracks, even from the lunar module, that Jack Schmitt could see right after they landed, looked out and could see these. So we've done photogrammetry on Split Rock here. It was a little difficult. It's in several fragments. The pictures themselves are close up enough to where it's difficult to really discern the arrangement of the rocks with relationship to one another. But as we come in closer, we can now see that constellation of rocks. We're going to do that. We can see where they parked the lunar rover. Once again, where there were panoramas, we see an arrow that points toward the lunar module. And so we're going to bring you up first to fragment 1. And there are fragments 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so once again, thanks to the close-up photography that was done, and which have been scanned up to 4K resolution on the Flickr site. We used the 2K scans because the 4K scans were almost too detailed to deal with. Hard for us to play back even on a good graphics card. But here we can see really that this models the rock very well. And we can see light-colored inclusions. And these rocks are of a different type. You'll see that this is a more solidified rock, and then we're going to take you over to one of the other boulders that has a more vesicular look. One of the downslope rocks, but here this is fragment 2. It's kind of cut off on the top because we didn't have enough photography to really cover the up to the top of the rock. But here, and then this is fragment 3, which had separated away from fragment 2, sort of cracked away, and then a little bit of space to fragments 4 and 5. And so as we come closer into fragment 4 here, a little bit difficult of a flying job. Mike is doing a fine job while I'm doing all the talking. But we can see this vesicular nature of this rock, and there is a contact that Harrison Schmitt, Jack Schmitt saw geologically. We can see a light colored inclusion of this that's here more toward the left in the image, but now also in the shadow we can clearly see the vesicles of this rock. And then to the lower right, we can actually see those are Jack Schmidt's actual boot prints. We can see the tread of his boot because he was standing in the shadow, and we can see that from some of the EVA footage. And so from this, we can actually see real human footprints three-dimensionally seen in the photogrammetry.
Already.
So with that, it's a lot to go through.
Bringing us back to video here.
But we've had a great time presenting to you all today, and it's a pleasure to be able to share this with you, especially at this time of such a historic time, 50 years after we first set foot upon the moon, another world. And so thank you very much.
All right, thank you guys.
Okay.
This is signing off.